to the Canada-Ukraine free trade agreement twice. They voted against. While the Conservative leader is busy taking talking points from Fox News and Donald Trump, on this side of the House, we support Ukraine.
He's not there for Ukraine, he's there for himself. When Conservatives demanded that the government provide lethal weapons before Putin's invasion, when they most needed them, he said no.
The Liberals and Conservatives have been fighting head-to-head for Canadian support since this government came into power. But over the past 6 months, there's been a pretty stark shift with Tory polling support kind of shooting up, with the Conservatives enjoying double-digit leads across a wide range of polls for months. But new data, this week shows Poilievre's party may have hit a fork in the road. The latest data from an Abacus poll, for example, conducted over the last week, shows the Conservative lead down by 5 points and the Liberals up by 4. Tories do still have a 10-point lead over the Liberals at 37% to the Grits' 27%. That's the most dramatic shift we're seeing, but it's not the only one. Nano's polling also shows, as you can see in the next board there, that the two parties have narrowed the gap, though not in as much of a pronounced way. Let's bring in the front bench to talk about that. Elliot Hughes is a political commentator and senior associate with Summa Strategies. He's a former senior advisor to Liberal finance and defence ministers. Former Alberta MLA and Cabinet Minister Gary Marr is here. He's the president and CEO of the Canada West Foundation. Anne McGrath is national director of the NDP, and Marieke Walsh is a senior political reporter with the Globe and Mail. Hi, everybody. Happy Wednesday. Marieke, I'll start with you because the poll was conducted, I think, from the 7th to the 12th. And we've talked actually in this group about how the government's attacks actually on the official opposition have certainly become more focused in nature over that last few weeks.
They've become more focused, and I think that the Liberals have really jumped on the missteps of the Conservatives to sharpen up their message. I think you see that they seem more emboldened on the government side of the House when they hear the Prime Minister responding to the official opposition leader's questions. And certainly I hear from Liberals behind the scenes that they not only feel like they're getting a little bit of their groove back, although they recognize they still have a far way to go, but they also feel actually that the overnight voting last week really was one of those sort of team building exercises, if you will, and sort of mended some of the fences that have been a bit shakier in the last few months.
That's interesting because I was also trying to think of the kinds of things that have happened, Gary, over the last few weeks. And often, people will tell me, it's just an Ottawa issue. People aren't paying attention to that. I don't know yet because this is just one poll, and we certainly don't know what kind of trend it might show us or might not. But it indicates to me that people are somewhat paying attention to what's happening.
I think that's probably true, although I would point out that we're a long ways from an election. And as former Premier Gary Dewar would often say, you shouldn't peak too soon. I think it's important to see, what's happened over the course of the summer, in particular. That might explain why the Liberal fortunes didn't look so good in the last year. You look at housing, you look at health, you look at immigration, you look at the cost of living, the price of groceries. There's a whole host of issues, and now maybe we're seeing a little bit of a change, but it's hard to say. It's not a trend yet, but there's a long ways to go between now and the next election. And I think both parties, in order to win the support of Canadians, are going to have to sharpen up their messaging and really focus on the things that are the most important to Canadians, and demonstrate that they've got policy chops to be able to deal with the things that are important to the voters.
Elliot, I thought also what was interesting in the Abacus poll, and just jumping off what Gary said there, is the degree to which when Conservatives are talking about cost of living, even the carbon tax, housing affordability, their message clearly resonates. Like when they're not diverted from that message, that's when you see their increases in the polls. But when they are diverted, either by their own, as Marieke pointed out, as some would term them, missteps, or by world events, that's when you start to see a bit of a shift.
Yeah, and I think we've seen that over the last couple of weeks. Marieke rightly pointed out some of the missteps. I think Ukraine votes, has resonated. I think there's some other small pieces as well. Even Pierre Poilievre's little spat with the media a few weeks back, you might recall. I think that sort of left a bad taste in people's mouths. And then you had smaller things like Andrew Scheer's wanted poster and Marilyn Gladwell's sort of Christian Heritage Month moment. So I do think they've perhaps strayed a little bit from their core messaging. Big picture, though, I think what's helping the Liberals is two things. One, I think, is slowing inflation, which I think is starting to be recognized by voters and starting to be felt by consumers. And that's super important because that's sort of the big piece. And I think the other piece is Liberals are being able to sort of jump on sort of these sort of conservative decisions around Ukraine to sort of show perhaps that they're more aligned with some of these right-wing voters, extreme politicians in the States. I think we talked on this program a couple weeks ago about sort of that change in tone about the MAGA conservatives, and I think what we've heard from the Prime Minister is starting to resonate. So I do think, though, that the PMO won't be doing backflips because of this poll. They are still 10 points down. They still have a lot of work to do. This could not be a trend, as you rightly point out, and we could find ourselves in January right back to where we were 2 weeks ago. So they need to continue to focus on the issues that really matter to Canadians, which is housing, which Minister Fraser's been doing a good job, and hopefully for them, the inflation continues to come down, which is something that the Bank of Canada is expecting, because largely these are, I would say, self-imposed or self-forced errors on the Conservatives' part, rather than something that the Liberals have been doing.
And you've been in many an NDP war room. If you were sitting in either the Liberals or the Conservatives right now, I know, and I agree with everyone, like it's one poll, we're a ways off from an election, but what would you take from it at this point in time?
Well, one of the things that I found really interesting about this, and I think Elliot's right, like we still have to see if this is a blip or if it's a trend. But one of the things I found interesting is that I have been assuming, wrongly maybe, that Pierre Poilievre's behavior, like the constantly like punching down and berating journalists, and the behavior of the Conservatives generally wasn't getting through to people because they have this sort of image makeover and massive ad spend, and that was actually what was dominating, so that they could get away with all of the other kind of shenanigans and stuff, whether in the House and so forth. And I think I might be wrong about that. I think that maybe Canadians are noticing some of that, because it does look like it's the Conservatives coming down more than the Liberals coming up.
Yeah, David said, like, there's no all of a sudden everyone's saying, you know what, I'm so into the government's plan, I'm so into the Prime Minister. It's actually that those who had been looking at the Conservatives as an alternative have become much less sure of them as an alternative.
And I have to also say that, when you go into an election, you can start way ahead and you don't necessarily end up being the government, and you can start way behind and you may end up being the government. And I've been on both sides of that.
It's almost like a warning to the Conservatives, though, that they've appeared less sort of cautious in their optimism in the last few weeks. They've appeared much more like they are expecting a win, like the Liberals are down for the count and not getting back off the mat. And I think this, even if there isn't a trend, it is a sort of a signal or a flare to them that maybe they need to be a bit more cautious in their boisterousness.
Yeah, they've been way too cocky and gleeful, and I think they probably need to dial that back.
We shall see. Gary, last word to you on that?
Well, I think that tone is important. If you're going to look like a government in waiting, I think to Anne's point, your tone has to be set the right way. It can't be cocky. It has to be humble. It has to reach out to Canadians in a way that Canadians identify with. I don't think that the kind of bolstered ego is necessarily something that wins you elections. I think that Canadians are a very sensible lot, and I think we have to, both parties have to be able to try and appeal to what I would call radically sensible, reasonable Canadians.
I do have 30 seconds left. So, Elliot, I'll get you in for one last question, too. It's interesting on that point. I remember being at the Tory convention, and there were a lot of people who have been around a lot of elections before who were saying they did not want to be cocky about it, that they were really giving advice to everyone to, like, take it in stride, get excited, sure, but to realize how fast things can change. I imagine that there's newer people who maybe don't have the same kind of experience, and they're coming up against each other.
Yeah, and this speaks to, I think, why some senior Liberals feel, maybe confident is too strong a word, but look, it's a long time till the next election, and a lot can happen. And as we've seen over the last couple of weeks, tides can shift, polls can move. And the opposition parties can make some mistakes. And that was over the course of 2 weeks. So let's see what happens over the course of 18 months. And the Prime Minister probably feels like the economy is going to pick up at some point. So hang in there and let's see where things are early 2025.